Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Ask Us Anything podcast. It has been far too long since the last time we had some questions, but we finally got 3 more. And so we're going to jump back in and keep addressing some of the questions that you guys are sending in. And again, feel free to send questions in at any point. They can be based on recent sermons. They can be just based on something that you're seeing, as you'll see in just a minute, in the news. Or things that you're just thinking and reading kind of in your own devotional life and things like that. But I've got 3 questions that I'm going to try to get through today, and I'm going to actually start with one that goes along with the sermon series that we just started. So just started a new sermon series this last week, a couple days ago, on the life of Jesus, entitled Encountering Jesus. And we're looking at different vignettes and stories of his life, whether it's encounters with disciples, encounters with people who need healing. But this last week, we started with the story of Jesus's temptation. And this is the question. It's based on that sermon. It says, when Jesus was tempted in the desert in Luke chapter 4 and other places, was the devil physically there, bringing him to places to tempt him, or was he attacking him subconsciously and giving him visions like he often attacks us? Great question. And actually, a lot of commentaries that I was reading this last week are kind of split on what they think with regard to the answer to this. Some people actually think that there was some kind of physical manifestation that was taking place as Jesus was doing battle in the wilderness. Other people actually think, no, this was more like what the question asker describes here, some kind of subconscious temptation that was essentially preying upon Jesus's mind, if you want to put it that way. But honestly, in the gospel accounts themselves, we're just not sure. The bottom line, though, is it really could be either. There is undoubtedly, I would say, a means that I would assume Jesus would have to see into a spiritual realm even more than we could, right? And so I think about, the example in the Old Testament when I think it's Elijah prays for the eyes of his servant to be opened so he can see the army of the Lord that is protecting them, right? That's one moment where in the Old Testament, as an example, somebody gets a glimpse into the unseen or the spiritual realm. But my assumption is because Jesus was able to see into hearts, because Jesus knew the thoughts that were going through men's minds, that Jesus had a capacity to see into the spiritual realm in a way that we can't. And so even if, somebody else would have been there with Jesus, and I know nobody else was because he was isolated. That's what the text does tell us. But even if somebody else would have been there, maybe they wouldn't have seen the battle that Jesus was doing. But Jesus had an ability to see into that. So I don't know that there's a real clear answer to that question. But I mean, in one sense, you could say either. Because whether or not the devil was there physically, some kind of physical manifestation, like we understand there to be in the Garden of Eden, for example, with Adam and Eve, or if it was more akin to kind of what we experience in our experiences when we're being tempted. In one sense, it doesn't matter because the bottom line was, as the one who intentionally went out into the wilderness to do battle with the devil, this was one of the many experiences that Jesus endured when Satan came at him and attacked him. Excuse me. I was even doing reading earlier today, and one of the other stories that kind of came through as I was thinking about this is in John chapter 6, where Jesus feeds the 5,000, and the other side of that feeding, the text says that the people wanted to take him and make him king by force. I think that's another experience where Jesus experienced one of the temptations that the devil was trying to give him. Hey, be ambitious, Jesus. You've got all this worldly approval right now. Approval ratings are high. You're trending on Twitter. The people want to make you the king. And yet Jesus, knowing what God had actually set before him and the way that his kingdom would come about through his enduring the cross was actually the way that Jesus went about bringing in his kingdom. But ultimately, in short, we don't know the answer to this, if this was a physical manifestation of the enemy or if it was a subconscious temptation. But the important part is that Jesus endured the same kind of temptations that we do. And so like the Hebrew writer says, and like I alluded to a couple times on Sunday, we know that we have a faithful high priest who, though was tempted in every way, was without sin. And because we know he was tempted in every way, the same ways that we are, he sympathizes with us in the midst of our weaknesses. And so like I talked about kind of as I concluded the sermon on Sunday, it's not just that Jesus is a good example of how to face temptation, but he is actually our substitute. He's the great protagonist who intentionally faced the temptations and never succumbed to them, but actually was victorious as the champion over all of the temptations of the enemy. And so that's the thing that we really need to take real comfort and find peace in. So again, don't know if it was actually physical or if it was subconscious, but the important thing is Jesus endured it like us, but he didn't endure it like us in the sense that he was always victorious. And so we rest in that victory of his. So 2 other questions. What I'm going to do now is go back and grab one that's been sitting there for a couple weeks now, but this is the question. Somebody wrote in and said, if an altar is both a place of sacrifice and also a sign of God's faithfulness, is it still okay to physically build altars, basically a cairn, in the wilderness as a sign of God's faithfulness? Knowing, of course, that with the building of that altar, there is no sacrifice that we bring, but rather that we meet Christ there at the stones of the altar with acceptance and remembrance of his sacrifice on the cross for us. We build it because we remember his faithfulness. And the context here that the question asker gives is that essentially they work in an outdoor education capacity, and they're wondering about incorporating this kind of experience into some of the teaching and kind of the devotional life of some of the students that they lead. The short answer that I would give to this question is a yes, but. So yes, I think it's okay because all throughout Scripture, you actually see various things that God will encourage his people to do in order to remember his faithfulness and the way that God actually has delivered his people. So an example, one of the first ones that comes to my mind is after God takes his people across the Jordan River and they enter into Canaan for the first time. So they've entered into the promised land after the days of wandering under Moses. And God tells his people as he parts the Jordan, he says, I want one of the elders of every one of the tribes of Israel to grab a stone from the riverbed. And when you get to the other side of the riverbed, I want you to set up a little memorial area, an altar, a cairn, if you will. And every time you pass it, or if your kids ever ask in coming generations, hey, what are these 12 stones doing here? I want you to give testimony of what God did, how he led us through the wilderness, how he brought us across the Jordan River and he gave us the promised land as our inheritance. I'm summarizing there, but that's essentially what the people were to do. And there are other moments throughout redemptive history where that takes place. I think in one sense, this is even akin, it's different, but it's akin to even the celebration of the Lord's Supper. So the Lord's Supper is different in the sense that it's a sacrament. But one of the things that Jesus did say is that he wanted us to eat and drink with remembrance. And so all of this to say, I think it's okay to do this kind of thing because it can remind us of God's faithfulness. I know a family actually in our church, and I really like this practice that they've adopted. I don't know if they still do it, but I know for a while they actually found some I guess you would call them maybe like gardening stones or something like that. And they would basically write an answer to prayer if they saw God answer a prayer or provide in some way. And they have a basket that that sits on the floor of their house now, that they write these answers to prayer, these ways that God has provided, and it reminds them of God's past faithfulness. And I think that is something strong that we can do, whether it's for the sake of our own faith to strengthen and edify it, or for the sake of coming generations, so that we can tell them, these are the things that the Lord has done. And that image of a stone, and I think this is one of the reasons why this idea of building some kind of altar of remembrance, so to speak, can be okay, is because one of the other passages that I think about is it's actually alluded to in the hymn, Come Thou Fount. So in verse 2 of Come Thou Fount, there's a phrase where we say, "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come." And that word, Ebenezer, is actually the smashing together of two Hebrew words, and it's a story from the book of Samuel, where God, again, provides for his people, and the people actually refer to God as their Ebenezer. And the two Hebrew words that are combined there to form that one word, Ebenezer, that's the way we would say it. In Hebrew, you would probably say Ebenezer. But it literally means stone or rock. That's the Hebrew word Evan. So even the English name, Evan, it means stone or rock. But then Ezer is the Hebrew word for helper. It occurs the first time in the book of Genesis chapter 2 in description of the creation of the woman or the wife to Adam. So Eve is the helper or the Ezer of the man or Adam. But it's a title that God actually takes on from his people all throughout the scripture. You can think of Psalms where it would say, Psalm 121, "I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord." That word help that gets repeated there is the word Ezer. God is our Ezer. Just like the woman was to the man, so it is that God, in his condescension, his willful condescension, he comes alongside of us to help us, to show himself strong on our behalf. And so this word helper, whether it's applied to the first woman in Eve, or whether it's applied to Yahweh himself or God, it's not a term of diminishment or some kind of subcategory of existence. It's actually a word of strength. And again, God, all throughout Scripture, calls himself or allows himself to be called our Ezer, our helper. And so this idea of building some kind of physical representation that reminds you of a time in God's life or in your life where God came to your rescue, where he demonstrated his willingness to help you, deliver you, encourage you, strengthen you, provide for you. It has really deep biblical roots. You could even think about how Jesus is the cornerstone. And how all of this kind of fits into the biblical arc or motif of this idea. So do I think it's okay? Yes, I think it's okay for a family to have a basket full of stones that reminds them of God's faithfulness. I think it's okay to use this as an expression of remembering God's faithfulness when you're doing an outdoor excursion with students that you're discipling or trying to teach about God's faithfulness. But here's the but. But if those memorial stones, if that altar ever becomes a form of a substitute for the real God, if it becomes essentially a form of idolatry, that it's almost like you feel like you can't worship God without it, well, then I think that thing has to actually be undone or destroyed. And there's good biblical expression of this as well throughout Scripture. So there's one of the chief examples that I think about is the strange story that's captured in the book of Numbers, where the people of Israel are wandering in the desert. They've been complaining against God, and God sends a group of serpents among them to bite them. And then he tells Moses, what I want you to do is I want you to make a statue of a bronze serpent and lift it up on a pole. And anybody who has been bit, when they look to that serpent or that statue, they'll be delivered from the pain and the poison of the bite. And they do that. Moses makes that, and that actually became a form of remembrance in the days of Israel, all throughout their history. But in the days of King Hezekiah, I can't remember what chapter this is, but it's going to be somewhere in probably 2 Kings. It also occurs in Isaiah, though, if memory serves. The people actually come to worship the bronze serpent. It's called the Nehushtan. In Hebrew, but they come to worship it, and so what Hezekiah does is he destroys it. He pulverizes the bronze serpent, and he then, kind of like Moses in the days of wandering in the desert when they made the golden calf, Hezekiah makes them drink the powder from this Nehushtan that gets destroyed because they had been committing idolatry. And so the caveat here is this can always become a form of substitute for worship. It's almost as if our human hearts as idol factories, like Calvin would say, we're prone to almost want these things or need these things so desperately in our worship that we almost feel like we can't do worship without it. And I think if one of these things, one of these physical remembrances of God's faithfulness, if it ever crosses the line to where you basically begin treating it as either a form of a good luck charm, some form of substitute worship or whatever, it's got to be broken down. And so again, I say this, yes, it's okay, but you always have to be on guard against your own heart and the hearts of even the students that you're leading and others, because what you want to be able to do, even when you're teaching about this, is give the appropriate caveat. Because even as this question asker kind of writes, they understand and know they're never going to offer a sacrifice on this altar. The altar is ultimately to point them to Jesus. Every one of those Ebenezers, those stones of remembrance, should point you to the chief cornerstone that is Christ, right? He is the cornerstone. And it's upon him and him alone as the rock of our salvation that our faith is built. And so I think we have to be really careful when it comes to these things. Again, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm saying that if you do it, and I do think that it's okay, because I think these things can be meaningful for our faith. I think you just have to do it with a recognition of the sinful tendencies of the human heart. And we can't ever escape those realities. And so asking God to keep your heart soft to him in the midst of all of it, and to bring conviction when and if those things cross some of those lines, I think those things are some of the key things to keep in mind there. So hopefully that helps. And again, I just to read the last part of this, one of the things that I am very appreciative of is that this person in their question also said, I want to make sure that I'm not disrespecting the sacraments, like communion, because again, it is unique. It's totally and completely different. That's something that Jesus clearly commanded us to do. To celebrate the Lord's Supper on a regular basis, to practice baptism. And so those two things, they're in a category all their own as sacraments. And so we have to understand that even if, again, we have a basket in our homes that remind us of God's faithfulness, or, we have something in our backyards or something like that reminds us of a season of God's faithfulness, it's totally and completely different than celebrating the sacraments. All right, well, last question, and again, this one just kind of rises from our cultural moment in many respects, but here's the question. It says, in light of the recent news, where should we stand on childhood vaccines and the requirements changing from a biblically sound perspective? Great question. I know that I'm probably going to disappoint whoever asked this question, because I don't think there's a way that I can give you a a black and white kind of answer here. And the reason why is because this question actually falls into a larger biblical category of the category of wisdom. If you go back when we were doing the series on Proverbs, one of the ways that I repeatedly would allude to wisdom is that wisdom is actually knowing how to navigate life according to its realities. And wisdom it's not always based on this idea of a clear-cut understanding of morality. Sometimes wisdom is actually based on a particular moment. And so I didn't get a chance to talk about this in Proverbs, but like a great example of a proverb is that I think it's in Proverbs 26. There's this place where it says, answer a fool according to his folly. And the very next phrase says, do not answer a fool according to its folly. And so it seems kind of contradictory in one sense, but it's not. What the writer of Proverbs, or that proverb in particular, is trying to get at is that you have to understand a time, you have to understand a moment, you have to understand a circumstance. And that is actually a great description of what wisdom is. And these are moments in this day and age where we need a ton of wisdom. So let me show you how this applies as I think about it in regard to a question like this. At the end of the day, I think Christians need to stand with personal conviction, informed conviction on questions like this. And every family is probably going to make a different decision in regard to how many vaccines they're going to have their kids get or not get. And again, that's going to be a family decision based on family convictions. But what's underneath that? Because again, I don't think that it is more moral to either get a bunch of vaccines or less moral not to, or vice versa. So again, I don't think that this is a question of morality. I think it's a question of wisdom. So what are some of the aspects of wisdom that go into this? Well, one of the things that I think about is the idea of common grace. We talked about common grace at a number of different points on this podcast, but just to remind you of what it is, common grace is essentially God's willingness to reveal through unsalvific means, if I can put it that way, ways that people can live wisely and helpfully. They're ways that God provides for people, even though they may or may not know him. And medicine falls into one of those categories of common grace. The idea of common grace biblically, by the way, comes from passages like Matthew 5, I think it's verse 45, where Jesus says, God causes the rain and the sun to fall and to shine on both the just and the unjust. And yet God is displaying his mercy. That's the context in which Jesus is teaching. God is giving mercy. He's giving an expression of his grace to both the just and the unjust, but it's not salvific. And medicine, again, falls into this category. Technology would fall into this category. You could say aspects of sports or entertainment, or you could put a bunch of different things into this category of common grace. And people are going to ask the question, should we or shouldn't we, have iPhones, watch TV, go to the doctor, get vaccines? All of these different things are going to be questions that, again, in my understanding of theology, and I think this is a Reformed understanding of theology, it fits under the category of common grace, which is something that we have to apply wisdom to. And so if God in his common grace gives people the ability to study and research and come up with various aspects of ingenuity, disease prevention, things like that, will we actually engage those things? Some people are going to say yes at a higher rate than others. And that's going to be because of their own conviction. They might look at the side effects, or they might look at the things that the costs and the pros and the cons, if you will, in the midst of this, and they're going to make an informed decision as they possibly can with regard to that. And I think that, again, that fits under the category of common grace. Some of the other ways, though, that I think wisdom applies to this is not just the category of common grace, but I also think it applies to the category of just biblical love. Because I do think that if we begin looking down on someone because of a decision that they make, we're not ultimately applying the biblical ethic of love. And that's a huge, huge pitfall that I think a lot of times we run into today. So could the biblical wisdom of a question like this fall into the category of what Paul writes, for example, in 1 Corinthians 8? In 1 Corinthians, some of the people in Paul's days said it was totally fine to eat food sacrificed to idols. Other people said you couldn't do it because if you did, you were actually compromising your faith. How did Paul handle that? He actually handled it by saying that you need to adopt a posture of love. Some people are going to eat food sacrificed to idols, other people aren't. But you don't go around essentially waving your I eat food sacrificed to idol cards or your I don't eat food sacrificed to idol cards. What you do is you let the law of love and faith working itself out in love, you let that be the guiding principle at all times. So rather than sitting in judgment on somebody based upon what they do or don't do, you actually seek to love them, especially if they're brothers and sisters in Christ. And I do think that if we're not careful, things like this begin to make dividing lines within the church. And I don't think that it necessarily has to or should. People are going to make their own decisions in regard to this, and we need to be really careful of making sure that we don't sit in judgment on people based on whatever decision that it is that they do make. We need to have humility, we need to have grace, we need to express love. So I think common grace fits in here. That's one of the ways that we apply wisdom. The law of love fits in. That's one of the ways that we apply wisdom. But one of the other ways that I would think about this too is, and this is one of the things that our day and age is full of, is that I think that we have to constantly be on guard against our own cynical hearts. Because we're at a point, I think, in this day and age where we're constantly looking for things and people to doubt. We doubt the government, oftentimes for good reason. We doubt the news, sometimes, and maybe you would even argue oftentimes for good reason. We doubt even the church, and we would even say oftentimes for good reason. And so what do we do in such a cynical age? Well, one of the things that I just want to try to, as lovingly as possible point out here is that one of the things that we can't do is adopt this high and mighty, I'm the only one who ever gets it right kind of perspective. And in essence, begin sitting in judgment upon everybody else who's just so naive. Because again, I do think that in a situation like this, and I'll just use vaccines as a great example, because you can see the polar opposites. People who would automatically say, I'm not going to get any vaccines, they're going to stand in judgment on the people who do get vaccines. The people who do get vaccines, they're constantly going to stand in judgment on the people who won't. And so here it is that we're back in the category that we need to recognize, things like 1 Corinthians 8 to be within. There is not just the distinct possibility or even probability that every single one of our extreme opinions is wrong. It's just a matter of fact. The only one who has a perfect perspective on anything and everything is God and is Jesus. And I think us being able to have a humble enough attitude, both towards him, but also towards one another, is one of the only ways that we're going to actually make it through life today. And one of the strange things that I think is true when it comes to this cynical moment that we live within is that a lot of times we might think that, in the midst of our own cynicism, that we're some of the most informed people with whatever our perspective is in the world. And that, we're the only people that really understand. We know exactly which news outlets to suspect. But the problem is, even with an opinion or a perspective like that, it's a perspective that's actually based on faith. And so you can't get away from this reality of like the fact that everybody lives on faith. Everybody is going to adopt a posture of belief in someone. You're going to look to a guru. You're going to look to a discipler. And this is one of the reasons why I think it is so crucial for us to understand discipleship into the way of Jesus. Because even his disciples, when he walked on earth, right, they would very frequently have their own opinion on something, and they would oftentimes get things wrong. And Jesus would have to lovingly, and that's the key word, lovingly, but still honestly rebuke them. So I think about John chapter 9, when the disciples come across the man born blind, and they think, oh, who sinned? Was it that guy or was it his parents? They have an opinion in a situation like that. It's informed by their cultural moment. And what Jesus actually says is, you're not thinking big enough. You're actually not suspecting yourself in this moment. You're actually not trying to think in terms of categories of wisdom. You're actually trying to think just strictly in categories of morality. And there are some moments where categories of morality have to be viewed within categories of wisdom. And I think this is one of these moments. And so again, when I step back and I begin to apply this, there's no way that I can say there is one biblically sound perspective on how to treat vaccines. I don't think that that's true. I just don't think that that's the case. I think that different families are going to make different decisions based upon their own study and research under the auspices of common grace. I think that we need to approach one another with love, and I think we need to adopt a less cynical posture, if I can put it that way, or perhaps maybe as I end this comment here, maybe we need to remember to be cynical towards ourselves. That's one of the very deepest pitfalls about cynicism, is that cynicism always stops with us suspecting ourselves. And yet I think that that's exactly where Jesus tells us to always begin. I mean, he says in Matthew chapter 7, at the very beginning of the chapter, that rather than us always looking at the speck that's in our brother and sister's eye, we need to take notice of the plank that's in our own. And so I think what Jesus is basically just saying there is, don't forget about cynicism turned back upon yourself. Don't forget about the suspicion that you ought to have about yourself and your own opinions. And so hold them loosely, hold them with humility. And yet hold them with a view towards the lavish love of God that's found for us in Christ. Well, again, I know that answer probably isn't satisfying to somebody who might want just a black and white answer, but I don't think that all answers in life are that simple. I don't think that they're that categorically extreme. I think that it requires a ton of wisdom. And so I hope at least that gives you a framework in which to think about it and consider it. But anyway, thanks for your questions. Keep sending them in. Always looking forward to continuing the dialogue. And I look forward to jumping back into this, hopefully on a more regular basis. But we're Center Grace Church here in Beverly, Massachusetts. We worship at 10:15 in the Cummings Center. And I hope to see you some Sunday if we haven't yet. Grace and peace. Talk to you next time.